January 1945. A U.S. Army prisoner of war camp sits under a low winter sky somewhere in Western Europe. The war is not yet over, but its direction is no longer in doubt. Snow clings to the edges of wooden barracks. Breath hangs in the air. Everything smells of damp cloth, boiled cabbage, and coal smoke. Inside one of the compounds reserved for female Axis prisoners, the routine is rigid and quiet. Roll call. Work details. Rations distributed with mechanical precision. Hunger is constant, dull expected. These women, clerks, nurses, auxiliaries, have been taught what capture by the enemy would mean. American guards, they were told, would be careless at best, cruel at worst. On this morning, a detail of U.S. soldiers arrives carrying ration crates. The amounts are correct. The rules are clear. Yet something unexpected happens. One soldier pauses. Another opens his own mess kit. Without ceremony, tins are set down that were never meant to be here. Meat, bread, coffee. Not confiscated supplies. Not surplus. Their own rations. The camp does not erupt. No speeches are made. But something shifts, quietly, irreversibly. And as the women stare at the food in front of them, the war they thought they understood begins to fracture. By late 1943, the tides of World War II had shifted decisively against the Axis powers. In Europe, German forces were retreating from the Eastern Front under relentless Soviet pressure, while Allied forces had gained a foothold in Italy and were planning the invasion of France. In the Pacific, Japanese expansion had stalled. Island after island was being wrested back by American Marines, and the once unshakable Japanese military machine was beginning to fracture. It was in this context of attrition and inevitable defeat that a less discussed front emerged: the treatment and containment of captured women who had served in the Axis war effort. These women were not frontline combatants, yet they had been integral to the war machinery. German clerks, secretaries, nurses, and auxiliary personnel had supported logistics, medical care, and communications. Japanese women in similar roles had maintained offices, supply depots, and hospitals, often close to active combat zones. When captured, they were transported to Allied-run camps, primarily in Europe under U.S. Army administration, though some were detained in facilities in the Pacific. For both the German and Japanese women, the concept of surrender was foreign. Propaganda had instilled in them the belief that defeat was shameful and capture by the enemy would be a humiliating ordeal. The Geneva Convention of 1929 governed the treatment of prisoners of war. Article 10 stipulated that POWs should be housed in conditions comparable to the detaining power's own troops, provided with adequate food, medical care, and protection for violence. However, the women arriving at U.S. camps had been primed for cruelty. German and Japanese military manuals described POWs as a potential source of intelligence, often encouraging harsh discipline. In the case of Japanese soldiers, surrender itself was considered dishonorable, and women accompanying the military had been trained in similar obedience to nationalistic ideals. Upon arrival, these women encountered a starkly different reality. Barracks were heated, though minimally. Blankets were provided. Food was measured but consistent. Guards treated the prisoners formally, with rules that emphasized order over fear. The initial reactions were often disbelief. Accounts in Red Cross reports describe German women entering camps with stiff postures, eyes scanning constantly for hidden threats. Japanese women sometimes refused to eat for the first days, uncertain if food was poisoned. Their initial suspicions were not entirely unfounded. Rumors of Allied mistreatment had circulated widely in Axis territories. Yet the U.S. Army's adherence to regulations, even in harsh winter conditions, slowly unsettled expectations. Rations, in particular, became a silent battleground of perception. Each soldier received a daily allotment of canned meat, biscuits, powdered coffee, and condensed milk, calculated to sustain them in active duty zones. The food was basic, often monotonous, yet reliable. For prisoners, food was both sustenance and a measure of how the war treated them. The first distributions to the women prisoners were technically routine. Each received a measure portion. But American soldiers, mindful of the psychological strain on those who had surrendered, occasionally went further. Where policy allowed for moderation and sharing, soldiers sometimes gave portions from their own mess kits, a practice that, while small in quantity, carried enormous symbolic weight. The women, trained to anticipate cruelty, were unprepared for such gestures. They had expected rations to be inspected, counted, and reduced arbitrarily. They had expected derision, humiliation, and surveillance. Instead, they received consistency, fairness, and, occasionally, the generosity of soldiers who themselves had little to spare. For German and Japanese women alike, this human decency was jarring. It contradicted every narrative they had been told about the enemy. For many, it was the first moment in captivity when fear was accompanied by confusion, a feeling so profound that it would shape their memories of the war far more than hunger or cold. The camps themselves were microcosms of the larger conflict. Women were grouped according to nationality, rank, or service branch, but daily life required interaction with American personnel and fellow prisoners. Work details included maintenance of facilities, sewing, office tasks, or assisting medical staff. These assignments reinforced the human dynamic. Those who had once seen Americans as faceless enemies were now forced into proximity with them. Trust was not immediate. Suspicion lingered, threaded with the memory of propaganda. Yet even under strict oversight, small acts of kindness, sharing a piece of bread, explaining the rules of the camp, or offering a warm cup of coffee, began to erode the rigid expectations of hostility. By the end of their first week, many of the prisoners had begun to reassess the nature of their captivity. The war outside remained brutal and unrelenting, but inside the barbed fences of the camp, another reality had begun to take hold. Survival depended not only on resilience and obedience, but also on navigating unfamiliar gestures of humanity. It was within this delicate tension that a simple act, sharing rations, would come to embody an unprecedented shift. The quiet acknowledgement that soldiers were willing to risk a small personal sacrifice to ease their prisoners' suffering would have consequences far beyond the immediate moment, touching upon the psychology, morale, and eventual reflection of the women in ways that reverberated through the remainder of the war. This first glimpse into camp life sets the stage for understanding the deeper currents at play. The world outside was still at war, yet inside, a small but significant moral experiment was unfolding. It is here, in these daily interactions, that we see the collision of expectation and reality, fear and compassion, discipline and generosity, a collision that would leave the women profoundly shaken, yet more humanized in the eyes of their captors. The U.S. Army's logistical system in 1944 to 1945 was a marvel of organization, despite the immense strains of global conflict. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles from the industrial heartlands of America to battlefields in Europe and the Pacific. Rations were calculated meticulously. Each soldier received a daily allowance designed to maintain strength and morale in both combat and non-combat conditions. Yet even this system was under constant pressure. Troop movements, weather delays, and frontline unpredictability sometimes caused shortages, and every extra portion shared with prisoners represented a conscious sacrifice of soldier resources. That Americans chose to share rations with women prisoners, knowing the cost, underscores the deliberate human dimension of their actions. The cultural chasm between captors and captives could not have been wider. German and Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as callous, even decadent. Newspapers, posters, and radio broadcasts reinforced the idea that capture would lead to humiliation, hunger, and degradation. Japanese doctrine, in particular, emphasized honor, obedience, and the disgrace of surrender, while German propaganda often depicted Americans as brutal and greedy. When prisoners arrived in U.S.-run camps, they carried these expectations in every posture, glance, and hesitation. The contrast between expectation and reality was stark, and it became apparent in subtle ways. The calm uniformity of guards, the precise measurement of rations, the absence of public shaming or physical intimidation. Women prisoners often faced additional psychological burdens. They were trained not to question authority, yet they had been placed in an environment where authority was exercised with measured restraint rather than domination. Many had traveled long distances, sometimes by train or truck, under exhausting conditions, only to be met with strict but unexpectedly humane oversight. Initial interactions were often tense. Women hesitated to take food immediately, fearing hidden traps or scrutiny. Some refused to speak, their silence a protective mechanism against an environment that, in theory, should have been hostile. In this environment, the arrival of American soldiers carrying their own rations marked a subtle but significant disruption of expectation. Soldiers opened their mess kits and placed portions on the tables of the women, sometimes even offering coffee from their personal supplies. The gesture was neither ostentatious nor ceremonial, yet its impact was profound. In the diaries and Red Cross reports of the time, captives described the moment as confusing, unbelievable, or shocking. The physical act of sharing food was inseparable from the psychological weight it carried. Here, food became a medium of communication, a silent language of empathy, an unspoken declaration of trust, and an unanticipated demonstration of American discipline. This episode also highlights the intersection of military necessity and ethical conduct. The war demanded efficiency, yet adherence to humanitarian principles remained a priority for U.S. forces. Sharing rations with prisoners was technically permitted, but only under conditions that maintained camp order and ensured that the needs of soldiers were not compromised. Officers recognized that maintaining humane treatment was not only morally correct, but strategically advantageous. Camps with better treatment experienced lower levels of unrest, improved compliance, and fewer health crises, all of which reduced the strain on resources. The act of sharing, therefore, was both a tactical and moral decision, reflecting the layered complexity of wartime administration. The prisoners themselves were forced to reconcile conflicting messages. On one hand, their training and propaganda insisted that Americans were cruel and untrustworthy. On the other hand, every small kindness, the ration shared, the measured word of instruction, the opportunity to maintain personal hygiene, challenged these assumptions. The contrast between American procedural fairness and the oppressive control experienced under Axis authorities created a cognitive dissonance. Captives began to reevaluate the war not only in terms of victory and defeat, but in terms of personal treatment and the human face of the enemy. By mid-1945, these experiences had accumulated into a profound psychological shift. German and Japanese women, once certain of the moral depravity of their captors, had begun to recognize patterns of restraint and intentional compassion. These insights did not erase fear or hunger, but they altered the emotional landscape of captivity. Small gestures, food shared from a soldier's personal allotment, assumed symbolic significance. They demonstrated that American discipline was intertwined with morality, and that the humanity of the captors was not merely an absence of cruelty, but an active, deliberate choice. This foundation is crucial to understanding the subsequent angles of the story: human, tactical, moral, and psychological. Each lens will reveal a different facet of the same event. The women's reactions, the soldiers' decisions, the logistical realities, and the broader strategic context converge to form a singularly compelling narrative. It is within this convergence that the story of ration sharing transcends the mundane and becomes emblematic of a larger theme: how simple, deliberate human choices can ripple across the landscape of war, leaving effects far beyond the immediate moment. For many Axis women prisoners, hunger was not merely physical. It was a measure of their expectations about captivity. They had been trained to assume that being taken by the enemy meant deprivation and humiliation. In German and Japanese culture, surrender carried layers of stigma, particularly for women associated with military units. Starvation, rationing, and enforced labor were anticipated. When American soldiers distributed food, sometimes from their personal supplies, the immediate reaction was disbelief. Eyes widened, hands hesitated over the tins, and lips parted in silent astonishment. For these women, the simple act of being offered sustenance by their captors challenged every preconception. Diaries and memoirs from the time describe moments of awkward confusion. Prisoners would look at one another, unsure whether to accept, fearing reprisal or trickery. The rations were never just food. They were proof of a reality they had been conditioned not to expect. The emotional weight of this experience was profound. Hunger, when paired with surprise and the recognition of humane treatment, created a complex psychological mix. Many prisoners described a sudden, unspoken shame, not at being hungry, but at feeling human compassion from an enemy. Some wept quietly in the barracks after meals, their tears not solely from physical relief, but from a deeper recognition of care and fairness. The human dimension of war, often eclipsed by strategy and weaponry, revealed itself most clearly in these small acts of generosity. Sharing food broke through layers of fear and skepticism, exposing vulnerability on both sides, prisoners and guards alike. The Axis women's reaction was rooted in cultural and military indoctrination. German and Japanese training emphasized that the enemy was ruthless and untrustworthy. Captivity was to be endured, not expected to be dignified. When American soldiers offered portions from their own rations, the prisoners' internal framework collapsed. Reports indicate that Japanese women often froze mid-motion, unable to comprehend why their captors would reduce their own daily intake for those they were trained to view as dishonorable. Similarly, German women were stunned by the absence of verbal reprimand, public shaming, or confiscation. The shock was compounded by the regularity of these gestures. Sharing was not isolated or symbolic alone. It became a repeated pattern that undermined every pre-existing belief about the enemy. This reaction is particularly revealing when contrasted with the behavior of Axis-run POW camps. Women in Japanese custody, for instance, were frequently deprived of sufficient nutrition, medical care, and hygiene. German-run camps often enforced strict hierarchies and punished minor infractions with humiliation. In the U.S. camps, however, the combination of consistent provision and occasional personal generosity from guards produced a cognitive dissonance. The prisoners were forced to reconcile what they had been taught with what they observed. Americans, they discovered, were capable of fairness even within a war environment, and, at times, of personal sacrifice. Sharing rations went beyond mere sustenance. It was a deliberate moral act embedded in military discipline. U.S. officers understood the importance of humane treatment, both for compliance and strategic stability. Allowing prisoners access to food, or giving portions from a soldier's personal supply, reinforced the ethical standards of the Geneva Convention and demonstrated the integrity of military conduct. While ration sharing imposed a tangible cost on soldiers already under strain, it was recognized as an investment in psychological order. Hunger can provoke rebellion or passive resistance. By choosing to share, the Americans mitigated unrest, maintained control, and subtly communicated that discipline and humanity could coexist. From the prisoner's perspective, this moral consistency was striking. The women could not ignore the deliberate fairness embedded in each action. They observed that soldiers followed strict rules, but occasionally bent them for the benefit of prisoners. That discretion was key. It highlighted the personal responsibility of the guards and the humanity that war often suppresses. The ethical clarity of sharing, grounded in a framework of both law and empathy, made a lasting impression on the women, challenging the dichotomy of enemy and friend they had been taught to uphold. Command structure played a critical role in how rations were distributed and shared. Officers in U.S. POW camps were acutely aware of the potential for disorder and the need to maintain morale among both prisoners and soldiers. Orders were clear. Prisoners must receive sufficient nutrition, but guards were permitted discretion in controlled generosity. Senior non-commissioned officers ensured that rations were never taken lightly, that soldiers understood the stakes of sharing, and that no action undermined overall camp discipline. This leadership was subtle but decisive. The acts of individual soldiers, opening a mess kit to give a portion of their own rations, were guided by institutional oversight, not improvised benevolence. The effect was cumulative. Small acts of human kindness occurred within a structure of clear authority, enhancing their psychological impact. The prisoners recognized this, consciously or not. Observing that generosity was not chaotic or random, but intentional and sanctioned, reinforced their perception that the Americans were disciplined, capable, and morally guided, qualities rarely attributed to them in wartime propaganda. The human, enemy, moral, and leadership angles together began to explain why a simple act, sharing food, became so psychologically powerful. It was not merely sustenance. It was shock, disbelief, and reflection condensed into a single gesture. This convergence of human emotion, cultural expectation, ethical conduct, and military discipline set the stage for more nuanced perspectives on the event, particularly technological and logistical considerations. Behind the quiet moments of ration sharing lay an intricate web of logistical planning. U.S. supply lines stretched across continents, from factories in the Midwest to ports in Europe and onward to frontline depots. Every tin of meat, every biscuit, every portion of powdered coffee was accounted for. Resources were finite, and soldiers frequently faced shortages themselves. That they could spare portions to prisoners was not insignificant. It represented a tangible sacrifice. Logisticians meticulously calculated calorie needs, ration rotation, and spoilage rates. Sharing from personal rations had to be managed carefully to avoid undermining troop readiness. Yet field reports indicate that soldiers routinely made these choices, balancing duty with empathy. In some cases, prisoners received slightly larger portions than regulations required, drawn directly from the guards' personal mess kits. While modest in quantity, these acts carried symbolic weight far exceeding their caloric value. They communicated intentional generosity, signaling to prisoners that the Americans' humanity was as deliberate as their military discipline. Although never intended as a weapon, ration sharing produced unanticipated psychological effects. For Axis prisoners, human decency contradicted every narrative they had internalized about the enemy. Disbelief became a form of cognitive disruption. Prisoners began to reassess assumptions about the Americans' character, the inevitability of their defeat, and their own personal expectations for survival. American leadership recognized, implicitly or explicitly, that humane treatment reinforced compliance and minimized unrest. Captives who were treated consistently well were less likely to resist orders, sabotage facilities, or engage in covertly hostile behaviors. Sharing food, thus, operated on multiple levels. It satisfied ethical obligations, preserved order, and reshaped prisoners' psychological landscape. In essence, compassion became a subtle instrument of influence, demonstrating that strength could coexist with morality, and that humane treatment could reinforce authority more effectively than coercion. The design of U.S. military rations facilitated this generosity. C rations, later replaced by K rations, were prepackaged and nutritionally balanced, allowing them to be portioned, transported, and occasionally shared without immediate spoilage. Soldiers could distribute items individually without complex calculations, and small adjustments in portions could be made without disrupting overall supply. Technological efficiency intersected with human choice. The ration tins themselves, engineered to withstand long transport, cold temperatures, and rough handling, enabled moments of generosity that might have been impossible with perishable food. Soldiers could offer prisoners coffee, canned meat, or biscuits, confident that the distribution would be safe and sanitary. This intersection of logistical technology and human intent magnified the impact of sharing. The act became both practical and symbolic, highlighting how material innovation and moral decision-making intertwined in wartime operations. The shock experienced by Axis women was deeply tied to their cultural and military indoctrination. Japanese women had been trained in a code of honor that treated surrender as dishonorable. German women had internalized propaganda depicting Americans as greedy and cruel. When these women encountered kindness, Their reactions were often disbelief, anxiety, or hesitation. Diaries and letters recount instances of prisoners examining each portion of food, wondering if it was poisoned or a test of loyalty. The effect was cumulative. Each repeated act of generosity eroded entrenched preconceptions. Over time, the women began to reconcile their prior beliefs with lived experience, creating a space for reflection and subtle moral recalibration. Shock, in this sense, was not mere surprise. It was the first step in a profound psychological transition, the quiet recognition that human decency could exist even in the midst of global conflict. Viewed together, these angles reveal the multi-layered significance of a single act: sharing rations. Human empathy, logistical planning, psychological influence, and cultural confrontation intersected in moments that were small in physical scope, but vast in emotional and symbolic resonance. Soldiers made personal sacrifices. Prisoners experienced a reordering of expectation. The command structure balanced discipline and discretion, and technology allowed these interactions to occur seamlessly. It is within this convergence that the event reaches its narrative apex. The shock, disbelief, and reflection of Axis women prisoners created a turning point in the daily rhythm of captivity, a moment when the ordinary became extraordinary, and when the moral dimension of warfare became vividly visible. These moments, repeated across multiple camps, laid the groundwork for the climactic moments of realization and adaptation that would follow in the final stages of their imprisonment. Spring 1945. The war in Europe was approaching its final chapters. In the rolling fields of France and the industrial ruins of Germany, U.S. forces had pushed relentlessly forward, capturing towns, factories, and strategic positions. Within this advancing front, a quieter but no less significant front was unfolding: the POW camps housing women who had served the Axis war effort. For these women, the daily rhythm of captivity had already challenged their assumptions, but certain moments in the spring of 1945 crystallized that disruption into profound emotional and psychological shifts. Camp Gunther, a U.S.-managed facility near Luxembourg, provides one of the most documented examples. German women, nurses, clerks, and auxiliary personnel arrived in late 1944, exhausted and apprehensive. Guards observed that the women anticipated arbitrary punishment. They expected rations to be withheld, inspections to be humiliating, and communication to be terse. Yet the Americans operated under strict discipline, but with deliberate humanity. On April 12, 1945, an extraordinary moment occurred during breakfast distribution. A young corporal, whose unit had endured weeks of combat and short supplies, opened his personal mess kit and offered portions of canned meat and coffee to a group of prisoners. It was small, technically against the expectation of personal consumption, but within the bounds of camp rules. The women froze. Some looked down at the tins, hands hovering uncertainly, while others exchanged glances of disbelief. Diaries from the camp describe a range of reactions: tears, silent hesitation, and whispered murmurs of incredulity. One prisoner wrote, "We could not understand. They were offering what was theirs and smiling. No question, no demand. Simply shared." The significance extended beyond nourishment. For the first time in captivity, these women confronted an active choice by their captors to prioritize humanity over strict regulation. Hunger was alleviated, yes, but the deeper impact was psychological. Fear, shame, and expectation of cruelty were confronted by deliberate kindness. In the Pacific Theater, Japanese women experienced a parallel phenomenon. At a U.S.-administered facility on a captured island in the Central Pacific, female clerks and nurses, who had once assisted combat units, were issued rations daily. In early May 1945, a small group of soldiers, aware that the women's prior diet had been inadequate and their training instilled a fear of betrayal, shared coffee and dried meat from personal supplies. The women recoiled at first, unable to reconcile generosity with the mental model of the enemy they had been taught to uphold. Observers noted that this simple act, merely a portion of protein and a cup of coffee, produced immediate, tangible shock. In both theaters, these moments followed a pattern. The prisoners' initial skepticism was overcome by repeated exposure to consistent treatment. It was not a singular event that altered perception, but a series of small, deliberate choices. Soldiers reduced their own rations, offered small comforts, and maintained strict adherence to camp order. This juxtaposition, discipline coupled with generosity, was disorienting. It challenged deeply ingrained cultural and psychological narratives, producing a mixture of awe, disbelief, and in some cases, tentative gratitude. This is the point at which the broader implications of ration sharing emerge. It was more than an act of sustenance. It became a psychological turning point. Prisoners began to internalize a new understanding of the captor. Americans were not cruel, capricious, or untrustworthy. They were capable of deliberate fairness, empathy, and moral clarity, even in wartime. The shock experienced by the women was not an isolated emotional reaction. It represented a structural recalibration of trust, expectation, and perception. Medical officers and Red Cross observers noted that prisoners began to respond differently in subsequent weeks. Compliance increased, health outcomes improved, and tension within the camps eased. Soldiers reported fewer disputes, and morale within the prisoner population, surprisingly, stabilized. The ripple effect of a few ounces of shared food per day extended far beyond physical nourishment. It influenced behavior, reshaped attitudes, and introduced a subtle, pervasive recognition of American discipline intertwined with humanity. This first part of the climax highlights the initial encounters where the prisoners' preconceptions fractured. What began as disbelief would evolve into profound emotional impact and behavioral change. An inflection point where fear and skepticism gave way to reflection and understanding. The following section will trace how these moments accumulated into a larger psychological turning point, ultimately redefining the dynamic between captors and prisoners. By late spring 1945, the cumulative effect of these small gestures had transformed life inside U.S.-administered POW camps for women. Repetition and consistency created a pattern the prisoners could no longer ignore. Their captors were disciplined, yet capable of intentional kindness. In Camp Gunter, German women began to accept rations more readily, though with lingering hesitation. The psychological weight of repeated generosity was profound. A nurse recorded in her diary on May 3, 1945, "Each day we receive food without humiliation. Each day it is offered with care. I do not understand them, yet I cannot deny that it matters." The language of disbelief is telling. Shock had evolved into a fragile recognition that the Americans' behavior was deliberate, not incidental. Similar patterns emerged across camps in the Pacific. Japanese female clerks and nurses, conditioned to fear arbitrary punishment and scarcity, gradually adapted to the rhythm of consistent provisioning. Soldiers did not merely distribute food. They modeled a routine of human dignity. Women observed careful measurement, orderly lines, and respectful interactions. When soldiers occasionally offered portions from personal supplies, the gesture became emblematic of a deeper moral framework, that discipline and compassion were not mutually exclusive. Prisoners began to internalize this structure, reconciling prior indoctrination with the lived reality of camp life. The psychological implications extended beyond individual perception. Prisoners who had initially resisted or hidden portions began to accept them without fear. Some wrote letters home describing the Americans' behavior, noting that even in war, they could act with fairness. This was not propaganda. It was first-hand observation that challenged decades of institutionalized belief. In effect, ration sharing became an unintentional instrument of psychological recalibration, revealing the moral dimension of the captors and subtly influencing the prisoners' behavior. Compliance improved, minor conflicts decreased, and a new, if fragile, sense of order emerged within the camps. The impact was particularly striking when examined through the lens of cultural indoctrination. Japanese women, whose training had emphasized absolute obedience and the dishonor of surrender, were forced to confront behaviors that contradicted everything they had internalized. Some wept quietly after receiving shared portions. Others expressed disbelief in diaries or letters. Similarly, German prisoners, steeped in propaganda depicting Americans as harsh and opportunistic, faced a moral paradox. Their enemies were capable of generosity, their authority both structured and humane. These emotional responses underscore the complexity of human psychology in captivity. Shock and disbelief were no longer fleeting reactions. They became a sustained engagement with a reality the prisoners had been trained to reject. This turning point also illustrates the subtle power of consistency and deliberate intention. It was not a single act of kindness that transformed the prisoner's perception. It was repeated behavior, disciplined within a structured environment, that had cumulative psychological force. Soldiers who shared rations, even at minor personal cost, conveyed a moral consistency that could not be ignored. Prisoners began to understand that the Americans' conduct was guided by principles as much as by regulations, a revelation that reframed captivity itself. Fear remained, but it was tempered by recognition of competence, fairness, and restraint. By the end of May 1945, these dynamics had created a striking transformation. Prisoners demonstrated calmer, more orderly behavior, and reports indicate that morale stabilized in a way rarely observed in Axis-run camps. The women began to perceive their captors as disciplined but ethical actors, capable of controlled empathy, a subtle but meaningful victory of humanity within the context of war. The turning point was not violent or dramatic in the conventional sense. It was psychological, cumulative, and profound. It reshaped the daily interactions of the camp and laid the foundation for post-war reflection, testimony, and understanding. These events set the stage for the aftermath. The consequences of disciplined compassion extended beyond the camp gates, influencing post-war narratives, military doctrine, and the personal recollections of those who survived captivity. The next section will examine the outcomes and long-term effects, tracing how this quiet act of generosity left an indelible mark on both captors and prisoners. With the conclusion of active hostilities in Europe by May 1945, attention turned from battlefield operations to the management and eventual repatriation of prisoners of war. For women detained in U.S.-administered camps, the experience of captivity had been shaped by repeated acts of discipline, structure, and unexpected generosity. The immediate aftermath of these months revealed both tangible and intangible consequences of ration sharing and humane treatment. Reports compiled by camp administrators, medical officers, and the International Committee of the Red Cross emphasized improved prisoner behavior and overall morale. Observers noted a significant reduction in conflicts, both among prisoners and between prisoners and guards. Women who had initially resisted or hidden portions of food now accepted them without hesitation. Minor infractions, which had been common during the early days of captivity, declined sharply. The provision of consistent rations and occasional supplement from soldiers' personal supplies demonstrated that humane treatment could coexist with military discipline, producing an environment where order and compliance were more easily maintained. Health outcomes reflected this stability. Malnutrition, gastrointestinal complaints, and fatigue were reduced compared with earlier months, and medical officers documented fewer severe cases among the female prisoners. This was particularly notable given the harsh winters of 1944 to 1945 and the strain placed on supply lines. The fact that small acts of sharing could measurably affect health underscores the dual significance of these gestures. They were simultaneously material and symbolic, sustaining the body while reshaping perception and emotional resilience. The prisoners themselves began to reflect on their experiences, recording reactions that provide rare insight into the psychological dimensions of captivity. Diaries, letters, and post-war interviews recount the shock of encountering generosity where cruelty was expected. One German auxiliary nurse wrote, "We thought surrender meant shame and hunger. Instead, We were given bread and coffee with no condition or scorn. I cannot believe it at first. Japanese clerks and nurses expressed similar disbelief, noting that the calm consistency of treatment, paired with the occasional offering of soldiers' own rations, challenged every assumption instilled by propaganda. These reflections illustrate that the human dimension of captivity, emotion, trust, and recognition of fairness, was as impactful as the provision of physical needs. Camp inspections during the aftermath reinforced these observations. Allied authorities, including Red Cross representatives, reported that U.S.-run facilities were notable for order, humane treatment, and adherence to Geneva Convention standards. Inspectors highlighted the importance of maintaining structured routines while allowing small discretionary gestures, such as sharing rations, to foster trust. The practice was recognized not merely as a moral imperative, but as a practical tool for sustaining stability, reducing unrest, and promoting compliance. By contrast, Axis-run camps, particularly those under Japanese authority, demonstrated higher levels of malnutrition, disorder, and psychological stress among prisoners, illustrating the stark difference in approach and the consequences of humane policy versus strict, punitive control. Beyond immediate camp conditions, the aftermath revealed subtle shifts in social dynamics among prisoners. Women who had once feared authority began to navigate camp life with cautious confidence. Relationships among prisoners were influenced by the shared experience of receiving unexpected generosity. Acts such as ration sharing fostered moments of trust and cooperation, even within the constrained environment of captivity. The psychological impact of witnessing human decency, particularly from those they had been trained to regard as enemies, instilled a sense of moral recalibration that persisted long after the initial moments of shock. The first section of the aftermath sets the stage for understanding the longer-term implications of these experiences. While immediate consequences included improved health, reduced conflict, and altered prisoner behavior, the enduring effects extended into the post-war period, shaping both personal memory and broader narratives about the treatment of Axis prisoners. The following section will explore these longer-term impacts, including testimonies, strategic reflection, and the quiet legacy of humane conduct within military practice. As the weeks turned into months following the German surrender in May 1945, the full consequences of disciplined generosity became increasingly apparent. The women prisoners, released gradually and repatriated to Germany or Japan, carried with them lasting impressions of their captivity. These impressions were not solely defined by fear or deprivation, but by the profound, dissonant memory of kindness from those they had been taught to fear. Diaries, letters, and post-war interviews repeatedly emphasized this theme. Small acts, such as sharing rations, had left an enduring psychological mark. A German clerk wrote, "We came expecting cruelty. Instead, we found measured fairness in food given from hands that had little to spare. I could not reconcile it, yet I remember it vividly." Post-war evaluations by the U.S. military noted the long-term value of these humane policies. Commanders emphasized that well-treated prisoners were easier to process for repatriation and less likely to harbor resentment or retaliatory tendencies. Soldiers themselves reported feeling that their efforts to maintain ethical treatment had created an unexpected bond, however tenuous, with the prisoners. These observations were documented in after-action reports, which highlighted the dual outcomes of morale preservation among both prisoners and guards and the reinforcement of U.S. principles of lawful, disciplined, and ethical warfare. The ripple effects extended to public perception and historical record. Testimonies given by former prisoners, often decades later, consistently referenced the shock and disbelief of experiencing American generosity. Japanese nurses and clerks, in particular, recalled that receiving consistent rations and the occasional share from soldiers' personal supplies had forced them to re-evaluate notions of honor, enemy conduct, and the very nature of defeat. In Germany, former POWs reflected that these experiences shaped their post-war views of the United States, instilling a recognition that morality and discipline could coexist even amidst total war. The physical consequences of ration sharing were also measurable. Nutritional improvements reduced illness, minimized weight loss, and stabilized energy levels, which in turn supported labor tasks, hygiene, and overall morale. Medical officers recorded fewer gastrointestinal complaints and fewer severe cases of exhaustion or illness compared to Axis-run facilities. These tangible effects reinforced the psychological impact. Consistent nutrition was interpreted not just as sustenance, but as proof of fairness and consideration. Strategically, the U.S. Army recognized that humane treatment could function as a tool for long-term stability. Camps that practiced measured generosity experienced fewer incidents of disorder, a smoother repatriation process, and lower administrative burden. The convergence of morality and strategy was clear. Acts of kindness did not compromise discipline. They reinforced it. The military's ability to maintain order while demonstrating empathy offered a stark contrast to the punitive environments of many Axis-run camps, providing a practical example of ethical conduct as an operational advantage. The lasting human legacy of this treatment can be seen in post-war cultural and historical narratives. Former prisoners frequently recounted their astonishment at American conduct, emphasizing that small gestures, especially shared rations, shaped their perception of the enemy more than the overarching strategic events of the war. These narratives underscore the enduring power of humane choices in shaping memory, morality, and cross-cultural understanding, long after the immediate pressures of battle had ended. By the summer of 1945, the combined physical, psychological, and moral consequences of ration sharing had crystallized into a quiet yet undeniable victory of human decency within the wartime context. The aftermath of these months demonstrated that acts of compassion, however small, could transform fear into cautious trust, skepticism into reflection, and hostility into acknowledgement of shared humanity. These outcomes laid the groundwork for the final reflections on what this experience reveals about warfare, morality, and the human capacity to maintain dignity even in the most extreme circumstances. The story of Axis women prisoners and the unexpected generosity of American soldiers offers a profound meditation on the human dimensions of war. Amid the chaos, destruction, and moral compromises that defined World War II, small, deliberate acts of empathy, sharing a portion of food, offering a cup of coffee, maintaining dignity in daily routines, emerged as quiet revolutions in perception and understanding. For prisoners trained to anticipate cruelty, these gestures shattered expectation, replacing fear with disbelief and suspicion with reflection. In the broader context of warfare, this episode demonstrates that discipline and morality are not opposing forces. Soldiers adhered to orders, maintained camp security, and followed regulations meticulously, yet they also exercised personal judgment and compassion. The choice to share rations, even at minor personal cost, illustrates that ethical conduct can enhance, rather than undermine, military effectiveness. Camps with such practices experienced improved morale, reduced conflict, and smoother administration, showing that humanity can be operationally advantageous as well as morally imperative. For the women who witnessed these moments, the experience left lasting psychological and emotional impressions. German and Japanese prisoners, who had been steeped in propaganda and cultural conditioning, were forced to reconcile their expectations with reality. The dissonance created by acts of generosity fostered reflection, reshaped perception of the enemy, and demonstrated that even in the extremity of war, human decency could endure. These memories endured long after repatriation, influencing post-war perspectives on morality, trust, and the capacity for ethical behavior in the midst of conflict. Ultimately, the episode of shared rations is emblematic of a larger truth about warfare and humanity. Small gestures can carry profound significance, shaping morale, perception, and memory. Amid the monumental machinery of global conflict, it was these quiet acts, rooted in care, discipline, and intentional empathy, that revealed the enduring power of human conscience. In a world defined by destruction, The sharing of a simple meal became a testament to the resilience of dignity, the unexpected kindness of those deemed enemies, and the subtle yet enduring triumph of moral courage over fear.